Hey guys, UnoPro here, back with my first video in a long time, and the reason for that video is a game that I'm extremely excited about, and that is Artifact. Now, what this video is going to be about, it's like my Let's Talk Duelist, where we take a subject and we're just going to discuss it and think about all the different things. So we're talking about Artifact today, and we're talking about the complexity of it. And really the complexity is why I'm so excited about this game. It seems like one of the most skillful, strategic, deep card games that we've had in a long time, and potentially to be one of the biggest because it's being made by Valve. So for those who don't know anything about Artifact, it's a Dota 2 card game, and the basic premise of it is 3 lanes, so you're playing essentially 3 mini games at once. So that really leads me into my first point of the complexity of Artifact, and that is that it has 3 boards. Now this is something I'm not going to really talk about too much. I think most people can realize that playing 3 boards makes the game very complex compared to something like Hearthstone, where you're playing on 1 board. You have to keep track of all the different boards, how they interact with each other, which ones you want to focus on, all these different things. There's a lot more information to take in that leads to a lot more decisions and obviously a more complex game. So that's something I'm quite excited for, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go, but I think for the most part that's pretty clear why that is complex. What that does lead to though is the tower system. Now the way the tower works is each lane has its own 40 HP tower, and after you destroy that tower it spawns a 80 HP ancient. Now the way to win the game is to kill 2 towers out of 3, or kill a tower and then kill an ancient in that lane. And this already leads to a strategic decision that is pretty fundamental to how the game is going to play out. Do you try and win the game by dealing 80 HP over 2 lanes and destroying 2 towers, or do you try and do 120 damage in 1 lane and kill the ancient? So there's 2 ways to win, and these already lead to so many different decisions. Essentially, if your opponent isn't going to be able to kill an ancient, you can give up 1 lane for free, and because you want to focus your resources the most efficient way, use them in lanes that can actually win, you can try and give away 1 free lane. But if you give away it too much, your opponent's going to kill the ancient in that lane, and you're going to lose before you can actually conquer the other 2 lanes. So that's pretty complex in far of the decisions it makes. You need to adapt on the fly, and I don't think it's going to be something like this deck always goes for the 1 lane win. There will obviously be some decks that focus more on going for the 1 lane win or going for the 2 lane win, but in general I think it's going to have to be something that you adapt to. So that's pretty self-explanatory, just like the 3 boards. Let's get into some reasons why it's actually complex that are just a little bit less obvious. So for those of you who have played Magic the Gathering, you'll know that the game is broken into a bunch of different phases, stuff like upkeep, main phase, combat, end step, where you're constantly passing priority back and forth, and the acting player, whoever's turn it is, always starts off with the priority. Now Artifact does that a little bit differently, and the way they've done it is actually much better for the digital form, where you're not constantly going through different phases. The way it works is each player either plays a card or they pass. And as soon as I play a card or pass, the priority goes to you, where you can play a card and pass. Now if both players pass, that lane is finished, the creatures attack, and you move on to the next lane. So this actually leads to a lot of interesting decisions, and the reason I actually really like this is because the priority, the starting priority on the next lane, is determined based on who passes last in the lane beforehand. So we leave these situations where, sure, there's less phases in Magic, but you're actually able to fight over who has priority at different times. In Magic, on my turn, at the start of the upkeep, I'm always going to have priority, and then my opponent's going to have it. No matter what he does, no matter how things work out, and then we go to the main phase, I'm still going to have priority first. Now in Magic this is a little bit less relevant, but it's still relevant for sure. In Artifact, this could actually lead to some really interesting decisions. It was brought up in one of the Rock Paper Shotgun articles, where even though you might want to play a card, instead you could pass and be the second passer, so that you can act first in the lane. Now this may be so you can kill something before they have a chance to protect it, or do a sweeper before they play something that punishes that or makes your spells cost more. There's lots of different reasons you can think of. And at the same time, you may want to act second in a round. And this may be so that when your opponent plays a creature, you can removal spell it, and you have already basically seen what their play is. Whereas if they already have a creature and you have a removal spell, you can play it, but they could play a better creature afterwards that you wish you could have removed. Or if you pass and hope that they play a creature, if they don't play a creature, suddenly they're getting free damage in if they just pass as well and the turn ends. So you don't get a chance to respond to all the information if you're going second. So at different times of the game, and depending on the deck and depending on the hands, you may want to go first or second on a turn. And this is something that you can actually fight over and make sacrifices to ensure by passing when you otherwise might like to play a card. That might be a lower impact than actually having the priority. So there's definitely some really intricate, really subtle decisions there that we don't really know how often they'll come up, but when they do come up, they'll definitely be a real test of skill and something that I think most players, they'll really be the separator, I think, a big separator between good players and great players, looking for these really tiny priority passing, which is something I really find really, really cool. And just the existence of a system where we're constantly passing back and forth, you can already see how that's more interactive and more complicated than something like Hearthstone, where you do all your cards at once. In Hearthstone, if I have 4 mana and I want to play 2 2-mana creatures, it doesn't actually matter what order I play unless they have certain battle cries or whatever. But in regards to what my opponent's going to do, it doesn't matter what order I play. Effectively, they're all at the same time. Now in Magic, if I play my 2-mana creatures and my opponent has mana available, I might want to play the one that I value less first in case it gets counterspelled. And if it does get counterspelled, then I am free to play my good creature. In Artifact, this could be very, very similar, where you need to think about the sequencing of your cards. Do you want let's say my opponent has some mana available for removal, I play a card, and then I would play my weaker card, perhaps. And then he's a little stuck with this awkward decision. Do I use removal now and kill this creature that I'm pretty sure might not be his best one? Or if I pass, then he can also just pass and not play that creature, and suddenly I didn't get to spend my mana at all on that removal spell, and he got to play a creature. So it's this sequencing idea that comes in and adds more complexity. There's also stuff like playing something that may affect the spells. You can think of a million different interactions, but it's quite clear to see that it adds in this sequencing effect rather than it's a sequencing that matters in regards to your opponent. Whereas in Hearthstone, the sequencing is really you're just goldfishing out the correct answer. There's a correct answer. You just got to think about how the battle cries, how everything interacts. But when we're playing around opponent, we're playing around cards by our sequencing. And I think that's something that's really, really cool and definitely looking forward to. So the next thing is the color system. Now, the way the colors work is that you have your 4 colors and you have heroes in each of these colors. Now, you can only cast spells of that color if you have a hero in that lane. So in lane 1, or the left lane, or whatever you want to call it, top lane, if I have a red hero, I can cast red spells. If I only have a red hero, then I can't cast any of the blue spells in my hand, or the green spells, or the black spells. I can only cast the red spells. And I can only cast them in that lane, unless there's some other effects. But for the most part, you're only going to cast them in that lane. And this leads to a ton of so many strategical implications about complexity. So one thing that is pretty obvious is that your mana suddenly becomes very easy to interact with. In Magic the Gathering, there's a couple of land destructions, but for the most part, you don't really interact with your opponent's mana. And once you have your mana, once I find my certain amount of red sources, my certain amount of green sources, I'm going to basically be able to cast everything as long as I have the actual amount of mana. Now, in Artifact, your mana, your colored sources essentially, are always up for fight because they're just a hero. They're something you're constantly interacting with anyway. It's part of the natural gameplay. So I could choose to focus, the hero that my opponent has 1 of or 2 of, because that means that spell, those color spells, while he's not on the board, he might actually be able to cast them at all. So you're constantly interacting with your opponent's mana, and that's not something we really see in Magic the Gathering for the most part, apart from certain decks and certain formats. But just natural, normal gameplay is interacting with mana, and that's something really, really cool. But apart from that, there's some very, very deep strategical implications that come to deck building. So let's say I have a very, very powerful, I'm a black deck, and I have a very, very powerful red card that I want to splash for. I know this card is really good, everyone talks about how good it is, and I want to put it in my deck. Now, in Magic the Gathering, it would be as simple as adding some, let's say it's a red gun. I'll add some mountains to my deck, just enough so I know I can cast it. In Artifact, you have a lot more to consider when it comes to that. It's not a mathematical equation, how much land do I have? It's considering all these different gameplay factors. So you have to consider, how often is my creature going to be alive? You know, can my opponent kill it? Can they focus it against the decks that this card is really good against it? Will my creature actually live? And aside from that, you're playing a hero. When you're playing this card, it's a given that it's being played in a certain lane, the lane that your hero is in, and it's being played in a lane that has that hero card in it. And that has a lot of implications in that the hero you have in a lane can lead to different board states based on the hero. So let's take it's hard to exactly explain this, but let's say something like Ragnaros in Hearthstone. There's a card that deals damage to a random creature, a lot of damage, or a player. Now, we can say on average, Ragnaros leads to board states that are more filled after the turn you played Ragnaros, and your opponent plays their turn, because they want to play around that ability. Whereas if you just played a normal 8/8, the board might get less filled on average the next turn. So we can see that there's responses to these heroes or cards. You might have a red card that's really, really powerful, and it sweeps all your opponent's little creatures. But if your hero leads to board states where they're going to be playing one big creature against you, then suddenly, even though this card is meant to be really good, you love to cast in the other lanes. Once we have that context that you can only cast in the lane of that color, then the deck building becomes very different. That card might actually be a good card to include. Or it may be something where we need to change our hero, or if we have this, we want a hero that kind of punishes decks for playing one big creature in your lane. You want them to be forced to build up a big board, and then you have this powerful red spell that can clear the board. These are just examples, but different heroes will lead to different board states, and you not only need to be able to cast that spell, have your hero live, you need to have your hero and the way you interact with that hero create board states where these spells are actually good. Rather than just saying, this is a good red card in a vacuum, I want this card in my deck, once I have this much mana I can play. It's just so much more complicated than that, and I think in regards to mana and interacting with mana and different color sources, this is a lot more complex than even something like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. So that's one I'm really, really excited for. I'm interested to see how much people will splash, just playing one or two heroes of a color, and how much we're actually able as players to interact and attempt to punish that by really focusing those heroes down. So that's the color system. The next thing I want to talk about was the card and mana resource systems. So you have one hand, spread across 3 lanes. So you can already see you have this one big resource, and you need to actually choose how you want to split it up. And you're only drawing 2 cards a turn. So 2 cards a turn, 3 lanes, it's pretty easy maths. You're not going to be able to just play 1 card per lane every turn without drawing cards and not run out of cards. There's simply not enough resources. There's always going to be trade-offs with resource management. And if you're not playing 3 cards in a turn, then suddenly you're mana inefficient, something that Hearthstone players, a lot of the time really, really hate doing, and for good reason in Hearthstone, because you get punished very, very hard for not curving up. If you play 2 cards, let's say it's just the first turn and each lane has 3 mana. If you just don't play in one lane, suddenly you've used only 6 out of your 9 of your mana. If you only play in one lane, you've used 3 out of 9 of your mana. So, and your opponent plays in all 3 lanes, then they've used 9 mana, you've used 3 mana. In a normal card game, that would be very, very disastrous. But they have made a very significant trade-off in that they've actually divided their resource over these 3 lanes. And we may say this is not something you want to do all that often in Artifact, because you're only drawing 2 cards. You need to pick and choose what lanes, what resources will go there. And it's not as simple as saying, okay, this card is best in this lane, I'm going to put it there. Because you may already, let's say that's already a lane that's going quite well, you might put the card that's, it's a bit average, but the lane will do alright. And our best card, it might not be as good in this middle lane, but I'll play it there because that lane really needs a boost. So you can already see there's a lot of different resource management. And I think resource management is the real big takeaway from this, is that you're constantly managing all of these resources. You're managing your cards, which lane they're going into, where you're putting your damage, where you're putting, how you're managing your opponent's colors, how you're keeping your color sources alive, all of these different things. There's a lot of resource management. And then on top of that, there's gold, which is what I'm going to get into now. So gold is another external resource where when you kill a hero, you get 5 gold, and when you kill a creep, you get 2 gold. And after the rounds end, so the lanes all have their turn, then you have a shopping phase where you can buy items from a random assortment. Part of them are from a deck construction element, and then you get to use those cards in the next game. And the reason I'm really, really excited about this is that it has a lot of parallels to sideboarding, except it happens mid-game, and that has a lot of implications. So the reason it's similar to sideboarding is that you have this pool of cards that is external to your deck, that you have actually control over as well, to an extent, lesser extent than a normal sideboard. But it allows you to adapt and choose these sideboard cards mid-game rather than in between games. So you have the ability to adapt on the fly to your opponent's strategy and their opponent's deck and choose which items are good for that situation. But there's also some more implications with that. I'm saying implications a lot because there's a lot of implications in this game. You take away a lot of the difficulty of sideboarding when you can just look up a sideboard guide and you do it in between games. You know, if I go on Channel Fireball, find my Magic deck, look at the sideboard guide, write it all down, suddenly when I'm sideboarding, I'm not actually making any decisions. There's no complexity there from my point of view, because I know this card pre-game is what I want in my deck, I know this card is not what I want in my deck. Now in a mid-game, let's just call it sideboarding for the sake of argument, you can't do that. You may know some cards are better in the matchup than others, but you need to know based on the current board state. It stops being a yes or no question. If I'm versing a burn deck in Magic the Gathering and I have a life gain spell in my sideboard, it becomes a yes or no question of I say yes, I definitely want that, and no, I don't want that card that loses life. You know, it's a yes or no question. There's no scale. There's not really a lot of subtlety. It's I want this card in my deck. I don't want this card in my deck. Now, when you buy items mid-game, it's not a yes or no question as an overarching thing, from an overall game point of view. Obviously, at the time you make a decision, but you can't just say yes, I always buy this item. No, I never buy that item, because in some situations on the board, an item might be good, but you need to buy the cheaper item to survive, or you need to save up for a more expensive item that can help you. So you have this sideboarding where you can't just follow a guide, you can't just have a yes or no situation, and it becomes much more of a scale of this card's pretty good right now, or this card's not too good, but maybe it's something I have to do, rather than yes, I want this in my deck, no, I don't want this in my deck, which I think is really, really good, and definitely something that will be able to differentiate players how they use this item deck. And I do hope that that's the direction Valve goes with it, where it actually has a lot of situationally very powerful cards that are dependent on your opponent's strategy. And let's say they actually did combine this with regular sideboarding, well, suddenly it becomes a lot more about your matchups and how your plans you're creating. You have a lot of ways to interact with your opponent's matchups. You can buy items, you can have sideboard cards, how do those things interact, all these different layers. And as they interact, they create more complexity. It's not a linear scale, it's an exponential scale of complexity. And it's something that I think is very, very exciting, especially for players like me who like to really get into a game and find all the complexities, and they want it to be skillful, and lots of avenues to improve. So that's basically the gist of why I think Artifact is going to be a very complex game. Complex does not necessarily equal enjoyable or even skillful necessarily. I mean, skillful you can argue about, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good game, that's for sure. But what we can see is, just talking about this in this video, we can see that there's all this complexity and it leads to these other decisions. And I think that's the real key, is that this complexity is leading to meaningful decisions that are very, very skill testing. And that's something I look forward to in a game. I think it's going to be a bit more of a serious crowd than stuff like Hearthstone for sure. But I'm very, very excited for it. And I think what we know so far, the core mechanics are very, very different from other TCGs and CCGs. and we really have a lot to be excited for. So I'm definitely going to be making some more artifact content in the future. If you like this video, or if you have any feedback, that's also appreciated. Feel free to like and subscribe. And yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you next time, guys.